If you think it's gotten harder to vote in Texas, you're not alone. Over the last 15 years, our state has followed a national trend of making it more difficult for Texans to exercise their right to vote. We can all agree elections must be secure and fair, but many observers across the political spectrum and across the state are worried that Texas has gone too far. In the name of preventing voter fraud, which historically has been and remains negligible, Texas is blocking eligible voters from casting ballots. Worse, we're creating the perception that voting is difficult, time-consuming, potentially even risky. That's not helping election participation, and that's no good. Every voice matters in a democracy. But it hasn't always been this way in Texas. How did we get here? Well, for that, we have to go back, way back. Maybe not that far back. Now, we could start our story a number of ways. With our nation's founders, the end of slavery, women's suffrage, the civil rights movement. But for the purposes of this video, the best place to start is the year 2000. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The world didn't stop when the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve. The TV show Survivor debuted. Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston got married. Most important for us, we had a presidential election that would profoundly impact the future of voting for Americans. Then Vice President Al Gore and then Texas Governor George W. Bush were competing for the presidency. Everything was proceeding unremarkably on Election Day, but by evening it had shaped up to be a very tight race, and it was clear it would all come down to Florida. First, networks called the election for Gore. Then they called it for Bush. At one point, the margin of Bush's victory seemed wide enough that Gore called him to concede the election. But as the count continued, Bush's lead shrank to less than 600 votes, and 2 hours after conceding, Gore retracted his concession. Florida law required an automatic recount. By the next day, the machine count showed Bush leading by just around 300 votes, leading to calls for manual recounts in some counties. Now, central to the confusion was the nature of the ballots themselves. In those days in Florida, voters were still casting paper ballots, which they marked by punching a hole in the paper next to the name of their preferred candidate. As you can imagine, this system was ripe for human error. Some holes weren't punched completely, leaving what came to be called a hanging chad. Other ballots had an indentation but didn't have an actual hole. This was called a pregnant chad. Some ballots had overvotes where the voter had punched holes next to more than one candidate for the same office. And in Palm Beach County, voters were confused about how to use what were called butterfly ballots. Well, after more than a month of breathless media coverage, the Supreme Court issued its controversial 5-4 ruling in Bush v. Gore, stopping the recount and thereby handing the victory to George W. Bush. While Americans were divided over the outcome of the election, everyone agreed on one thing. Nobody wanted a repeat of that uncertainty and chaos to happen anywhere in the country ever again. Enter Congress and the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. HAVA. When it was passed in 2002, HAVA overhauled a national election system that definitely needed to be brought into the 21st century. Before HAVA, for the most part, each state was free to set its own rules and systems for administering elections, and there were significant differences across the country. One example, Texas passed a state law in 1985 to ensure Texans with disabilities could access voting. That's something most states didn't do at that time. All states had to comply with the Voting Rights Act and the National Voter Registration Act. But those laws alone are not enough to ensure that eligible voters have access to the ballot. HAVA created new national standards not for who is allowed to vote, but for how American elections are administered. HAVA made sweeping changes aimed at creating a cohesive, truly national system. Some of the most significant changes were mandating new voting equipment, replacing punch cards and levers, and getting rid of those chads forever. Requiring the establishment of statewide voter registration databases to improve the accuracy of voter rolls. Requiring provisional voting to ensure that voters aren't disenfranchised due to administrative errors. And making voting more accessible for voters with disabilities, in part following Texas's lead. To operationalize it all, Congress provided funding and established the U.S. Election Assistance Commission to help states implement HAVA's policies. HAVA aimed to improve administration of federal elections, but the changes, of course, impacted elections at every level of government. For Texas voters, the switch to electronic voting machines was probably the most obvious change, and the introduction of provisional balloting, which has helped Texans to cast ballots whose ballots in the past would have been rejected. Behind the scenes, one of the largest HAVA impacts was the creation of the statewide voter registration database, what's known as TEAMS in Texas. While there was concern by local and county officials about the significant hardware and administrative requirements mandated by HAVA, implementation in Texas largely proceeded smoothly, thanks to federal funding and the strong leadership of the Secretary of State's Elections Division. But while all those HAVA-led improvements were being implemented across the country, out in local communities, the voters themselves were losing faith in the electoral process. Partly it was suspicion about the security of electronic voting machines. Partly it was the rise of social media and misinformation. For some Americans, it was a reaction to a troubled economy, maybe dissatisfaction with the outcome of the 2008 presidential election. But in any case, across the country, the questions and distrust manifested in allegations about lack of security in American voting systems. And in Texas, all those nagging questions boiled over in the 2011 legislative session. That's when legislation requiring voters to show photo ID at the polls passed for the first time in our state. But that wasn't enough to satisfy election skeptics. In 2017, Texas lawmakers banned straight-ticket voting, and then in 2021 came sweeping changes. They included bans on 24-hour voting and drive-through voting, which had been used during 2020 in Harris County. Changes to mail-in ballots requiring voters to provide their driver's license number or partial Social Security number on applications and envelopes. Bans on unsolicited mail-in ballot applications by public officials, including felony penalties for violations. New authority and rights for poll watchers. Those are partisan individuals who are empowered to observe the election process inside local polling locations. Monthly citizenship checks of Texas's voter rolls. And new rules for assisters, like personal attendants and family members, including restricting the kinds of help assisters can provide and requiring assisters to take an oath. The news has not been 100% bad. Changes in mail-in ballots now allow ballot corrections online, and in the 2025 session, Texas increased the early voting period. Early voting used to end on the Friday before Election Day, and starting in 2028, that 3-day gap will be gone. While it's expected to pose some administrative challenges for counties, most folks agree it's a win for voters. So far, Texas has avoided some of the most extreme proposals. For example, an effort to require proof of U.S. citizenship to register or change your voter registration was introduced in 2025, but did not pass. We should expect to see continued efforts to change Texas elections. For example, the Republican Party of Texas has filed a federal lawsuit seeking to close the primary elections. Unlike many states, Texas voters currently do not have to register under a party affiliation. In Texas, you can vote in the Democratic primary in one election cycle and switch to Republican in the next cycle without changing your registration. Moving to a closed primary would both restrict voter access to elections and create significant cost and administrative challenges for county election administrators. Given all these recent changes, you might wonder how Texas compares to the rest of the country. Are our laws really more restrictive than others?
A few specifics stand out. Texas does not allow same-day voter registration, unlike 23 other states and the District of Columbia. Texas does not allow online voter registration, unlike 42 other states, including Florida, Georgia, Ohio, even Oklahoma. Texas does not allow universal absentee voting, unlike 28 other states. In Texas, you must provide an excuse to vote absentee, and there's a list of what excuses are acceptable. And Texas is among the 24 states that do require a photo ID to vote in person. The other states require either an ID without a photo or no ID at all.
So with all those restrictions and requirements and revisions to our systems, what does a registered Texas voter need to know to exercise their franchise? Well, to vote in Texas, first you need to make sure you're registered to vote at least 30 days before the election. If you're voting in person, you need to locate your polling place and find out their hours of operation. You need to make sure that you have one of the approved forms of photo identification. You need to note the dress code. You may not wear clothing or accessories displaying the name of a current candidate for office inside the polling place. And you need to write on paper any information about candidates or issues that you want to have with you in the voting booth. You can't take a phone or other electronic device with you. If you're voting absentee, you need to decide far in advance if you want to vote by mail so you can apply and receive your ballot. When you receive your ballot, complete and return it promptly, and be sure to track your ballot online and follow up quickly if you can't verify that it's been received by your local elections office. If you're voting curbside, you need to be sure that anyone accompanying you has an ID and knows the rules for assisters. With all those rules and regulations, it could be tempting to just opt out. After all, how much difference can your one vote make anyway? The answer is your vote is exactly as important as any other person's, and you have the right to vote if you are eligible. Voting is a matter of faith, citizenship, and democracy. Voting, whether on issues or candidates, is a way of saying what kind of community you believe we should inhabit together. It's an opportunity to influence the policies that structure the lives of all the people in the community. In American democracy, voting is one important way to love your neighbor.